السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته والحمد لله حمدا شاكرين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Welcome, alhamdulillah, on this very important presentation called I Can't Breathe. I am Dr. Osman Latiff, and this is with Sapiens Institute. This is, in fact, I think one of the most important topics for all of us to consider. We are, of course, when we consider ourselves as human beings, we are, of course, able to perform amazing acts, dizzying, dazzling acts of goodness, of kindness. And we, in fact, we see them, we feel them, we experience them like on a daily basis. We see love, we see mercy, we see kindness, we see attachment, we see comradeship, we see all kinds of beautiful things in our relationships. But we also have, you know, a darker potential that human beings have. And I think one of the worst kinds of those dark potentials of human beings is to otherize other people. What that means, therefore, is to subjugate, is to relegate, is to marginalize other people, so that we tend to believe that the kind of basic rights we should be afforded as human beings, or the ones that we love should be afforded as human beings, is not the same as those others over there. And this, therefore, when it becomes unchecked, leads to even worse mechanisms like dehumanization. We're going to cover all of these, inshallah, today in our presentation. So therefore, this is called I Can't Breathe. Now, that statement, I can't breathe, I think it relates to all of us. I think all of us know something about the context of that statement, I can't breathe. In fact, it's a declarative. It's a declarative, I can't breathe. That statement, declarative, I can't breathe, in fact, became, in 2014, one of the most notable quotations in the Yale Book of Quotations in that year. And we're going to go through the context of that statement, the victimization of people, of course, whose final last words was that declarative statement, I can't breathe, and then look at the way that people in human history and today, of course, are being otherized, and the dangers that this leads to. We're going to look at things like social death, social dying. We're going to consider historical examples, current contemporary examples also, and then look at the worst constructs of dehumanization and genocidal tendencies emerging out of othering and dehumanization as well. And then think about the Islamic response, the Islamic solution, looking at the Quranic narrative, looking at the prophetic example, and how othering and dehumanization was understood, and how it was put in its right place, and how it was, you know, it was challenged and it was dealt with in those traditions. So we're going to begin, inshallah, in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I can't breathe. Here we are. So now we can't breathe, and why that's important is because there is something that does target our collective human conscience. And I think that if we think about, and I think it could be quite true, that if we think of those murders of these individuals, Eric Garner 2014, David Dungay 2015, Adama Traore 2016, and most recently George Floyd 2020, in some ways they come to symbolize a kind of a watershed moment, or moments for us in human history. And why that is because, you know, watershed moments don't always have to be grand events. It could simply be times of you know, narrative change. It could be times of paradigmatic changes in human society. And it's also true that those are going to be felt by some, maybe more than others. The family members, the ethnic communities might feel those more than others. But I think that there is a kind of a tugging at our collective human conscience when we saw what we saw most recently in the tragic killing of George Floyd in 2020, but also, in fact, in Eric Garner, in fact, sticks in my mind a lot. And in fact, Eric Garner is something I discussed in my book on Being Human, How Islam Addresses Othering, Dehumanization, and Empathy, which is available for free download at Sapiens Institute website. And so therefore, think about that, the idea of our collective human consciousness, meaning that we're all in many ways speaking the same languages. We're all feeling the same kinds of things. The way that empathy, of course, is constructed for every single one of us is different, because we have different social human life experiences. But the point is that we do feel. And that's the whole point, that we do feel. There's an amazing account of, and I discuss this again in my book, of Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning. Of course, Viktor Frankl was an Auschwitz survivor, Holocaust survivor, but he describes this really remarkable scene, haunting but remarkable as well, that he's in his carriage with some other Auschwitz prisoners, and they're being transported to another prison. And what happens is he describes this moment in the carriage. There's only a few of them there being transported, and there is, of course, a slit, a gap in the doors of the carriage, and they're able to see where they're going. Remember, of course, this was the homeland for many of these people in Poland. Many people lived, in fact, in those areas, or they knew, in fact, the landscape of where they were. And so what makes it so interesting, and this is, again, the power of empathy, but also the in some respects, the limitations of empathy, is because Viktor Frankl was the one who was asked to go and check and see if they could see where they are, right? If they could recognize, buildings and the landscape and sites of significance, and as they're passing through, they see that they're going past another of the death camps that had a kind of a horrific reputation. Of course, they were all gruesome, but he describes this moment, and he says that when they passed it, he says the sense of jubilation that they felt at that moment in time, knowing that they're not going to that one, was something. And he says that no one could have known what we had felt at that moment unless you were in the carriage with us. So the whole point is that empathy is so powerful, but empathy breeds from an individual human life experience. All of us feel different things because of who we are, where we've been, what we've seen, what we're seeing. That has a bearing on how we feel about those things. But in a generalized sense, we simply feel. That's the whole point. So therefore, our collective human conscience can be tugged at moments like this. And of course, there is a media narrative around that story that's played, and we see that often, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to, in fact, start with, well, if you first think about these individuals, Eric Garner, 2014, David Dungay, 2015, Adama Traore, in fact, was a French Malian victim, and he was put in police custody, and he was apprehended by the police, and his final words were Adama Traore. I want to read for you something that his sister, in fact, said. She said that his sister Assa Traore said about her brother that, and she spoke about her brother Adama Traore and George Floyd in the same kind of context. This is, of course, later after the killing of George Floyd. She said that they died in the exact same way. They carried the weight of 3 cops on them. They had the same words, and that was the end of George Floyd, and that was also the end for my brother. But it is, in fact, what really struck me with what she said is the word, the weight. It is the weight. So therefore, the physical bearing, the physical weight, the physical pressure that led to these victims to gasp in their final moments, those final words of "I can't breathe," meaning the suppression of breath, the inability to breathe, to have lack of access of air, of oxygen, that would, of course, be the necessity of life itself, is understood in this sense. I think when we look at it also figuratively and metaphorically, what does weight actually mean? And what does weight mean really in our collective human conscience? All right. To what extent do we feel that sense of burden, the burden of weight? of responsibility, right? That might breed what we call a witness empathy in all of us, or any of us, right? That could propel us to do something, to change, to alleviate the suffering of any people, right? All depends, in fact, on that weight on our human conscience, right? And so therefore, we're going to start with this poem. This poem is called The Haunted Oak. Paul Laurence Dunbar is probably the most celebrated of all African-American poets. He was young, in fact, a remarkable poet. And the poet that I want to discuss, or some of the poetry of the poem, is called The Haunted Oak. Now, this poem, in fact, has this was published and written in 1900. It could have been based, in fact, on any of the dozens of lynchings in that year. But in fact, this poem, The Haunted Oak, has a narrative, has a context, and it says that that once Paul Laurence Dunbar was passing through a village, and he met a man from Alabama, and he was complaining, or he was speaking to Dunbar about the fact that his nephew had been lynched on this oak tree. And he said that now this oak tree, it shrivels, and it becomes yellow, and the leaves fall off, it withers away. And it's withering away, he's saying, because of the fact that this oak tree experienced what it experienced in having this innocent African-American victim lynched on the oak tree. There's a lot, in fact, about this. When I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau some years ago, I remember asking, in fact, the tour guide that, because there's trees, of course, in the perimeter of the camps, and I asked the tour guide, were there trees, during the years of the Holocaust? Were there trees? And she said, yeah, and they were the first witnesses, and that really struck me. In fact, I was almost anticipating her, to be honest. I was almost anticipating that she would say that, because that's exactly what I was feeling at the same time, that they were the first witnesses to this. Meaning the first, what she's trying to say, therefore, is that they were there, right, before and after and during what the victims of Auschwitz-Birkenau experienced. Allah in the Quran says, Wallahu ala kulli shay'in shaheed, Allah is a witness over all things. And so therefore, this is it's a longer poem, The Haunted Oak, and I have much more of the poem in my book on being human. But this is a line that sticks out for me. Now, of course, in this poem, the oak tree is personified. The oak feels what this victim feels. The oak experiences what the victim experiences. The oak feels that sense of pain, because of the proximity, the closeness, the anguish of the victim. And in this line, it says, I feel the rope against my bark and the weight of him in my grain. I feel in the throe of his final woe the touch of my own last pain. Right? So think about that. Look at the words there. The weight of him, the weight of him, the throe in his final woe, the touch of my own last pain. There's a kind of a coalescing, there is a conjoining, there is a merging together of the tree and the victim, in that what the victim experiences, the tree has a feel of that, in that there is a sense of dissipation as the life of that victim is being drained out of that person. There is a dissipating in the life of the tree. The tree, therefore, is dying as the lynched victim is also dying, right? So therefore, and the idea is that the personified tree is an active, intimate witness, as opposed to being a spectator or a bystander. The tree here, in fact, is a witness, and is unable to withstand the memory of the horrors that the tree witnesses. So therefore, the idea, these themes of witnessing, of burden, of weight, and our collective human consciousness are very powerful here. So therefore, we're looking at these examples of Eric Garner, David Dungy, Adam, and there's of course so many more as well. George Floyd, I can't breathe, meaning we can't breathe, just like the tree that's in the frame of human life and death experience of the victim that Paul Laurence Dunbar writes about. Just like he's, of course, unable, the tree is unable to cope or unable to withstand the horrors of that. There is a sense of kind of a collectivizing then, the collectivizing in the collective pronoun, the plural pronoun, we can't breathe. So the individual person pronoun I mean that's a human tragedy connected to that human individual. And they, you know, we can't have an exactness of empathy here. Why? Because everyone is in their own human spirit. Just like the example of Viktor Frankl I mentioned, being in that carriage as they're passing through, and he's seeing from that gap in the carriage that they're not stopping at the death camp that they were worried about, but they're still in that experience of horror and tragedy that is the Holocaust. But he said just a sense of jubilation that they experience. He said that unless you were there in the carriage on that day at that specific point in time, you could never have felt what we had felt. So therefore, I can't breathe must remain. I can't breathe for those victims, but we can't breathe. The plural pronoun, the collective pronoun here becomes more understood or more acceptable, in a sense that the understanding that there is a burden, there's a human burdening, there is a kind of a tugging at the human collective conscience that we all should be experiencing. And that's really one of the great points of this presentation to begin with. What does I can't breathe really mean for us as human beings in this context that we're living in, and that we might continue to live in the future also? That we turn the I can't breathe into a we can't breathe if we understand it from the point of the collectivized burdening, the collectivized weight of human responsibility. And that's really, I think, coming through quite strongly in the poem of Paul Laurence Dunbar. So therefore, the weight, as you can see, the weight, the feel, and the touch the oak tree experiences symbolizes the burdens we confront in our world. Now, over here, let's have you can see. Yeah, we confront from the otherized or othered victims of our world. All right, so what is othering then? So what is it? So we're speaking about othering or otherizing, the other. What exactly or who exactly is that other? Now, the other is, or the othering is, a negating of another's individual and social worth. As I mentioned, it is to believe that another person outside of us, they could be culturally different, they could be different in terms of look, they could be physically away from us, but we could run the risk of othering those people if we tend to believe that those others or that other is undeserving of the basic human rights that we believe are afforded or should be afforded unto us, or the ones that we actually love. Now, I've put here social death and dying, which I think is really important. There's a really interesting book by Dave Grossman called On Killing. It's the psychological effects of killing and war. And he makes this point, and he says that the closer a perpetrator perceives of a victim, it's like any of us, really, the more we perceive of others, the closeness or the distance by which or through which we're perceiving of others has a bearing on our attitude towards those people. And he has a section called Altitude and Attitude. And he says altitude because he gives these examples of let's say soldiers or army personnel in their fighter jets, and they're so high up in altitude, and they drop bombs on civilian populations, who of course end up being killed in these. But because they're so far up, they don't see what they're doing, or they don't have that sense of distance. Is a detachment, emotional detachment that they have towards the victims that they're actually killing. They don't see the horrors, they don't see the anguish, they don't see the blood, they don't see the decimation of landscape and town and village and city. They don't see that, and so therefore that sense of indifference is with them because of the altitude. But if they're closer down, if they're down with the victims, then of course they'll see more of that. And there's so many examples of these And of course, the same is true in the Holocaust and in all examples of human genocide. The fact that the perpetrators would say these kinds of things, that, you know, when we were up close, we could see the horrors on the faces. And it's a very good book called Time for Machetes, by John Hatzfeld, which again is discussed in my book on Being Human, about the genocide of Rwanda. And it's written by perpetrators, you know, of that horrific genocide in April to June or July 1994. And so therefore, what happens is that the victims, they experience a social death or a social dying. And this happens when the victims are kind of pushed to the margins of what's socially acceptable, excommunicated from what we believe to be standard and normal for all other people. What's normal and moral in society, it simply doesn't apply to them anymore. And this, of course, is discussed, like I mentioned, in Dave Grossman's book on Being Human. Now, what happens in addition to this is that if a group of people are socially dead in society, meaning because they're not given consideration, worth, value, there's no sense of, you know, merging of societal identities together, they're kind of marginalized, they're ostracized, they're kept in their own places. It's not just that they experience social death, but what social dying therefore means is it means generational death. It means generational change. It means that not only have those individuals now died because they've been othered, right? They've been castigated away from everybody else, the norm, but it means that their descendants will no longer be able to live, you know, in as normal, not functioning, but acceptably functioning members of society because of the fact that their parents or their ancestors' sense of social worth was decimated in the first place. This, in fact, is quite interesting because of the idea of ethnic cleansing. So if you think, therefore, about the events of 1948 in Palestine, the Nakba, the catastrophe, ethnic cleansing. So in the words of Ilan Pappé in his book, Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and so many others also, the ethnic cleansing was, in fact, a precipitating of, a creating of social death and social dying. So the inhabitants of the 500-600 villages that were destroyed from the 1948 Nakba, and even in fact before that as well, meant that there is now going to be a sense of invisibility in those landscapes, or new landscapes, meaning invisibility as per the previous inhabitants of those villages. And so ethnic cleansing, therefore, meant not just the forced expulsion of the inhabitants from their homes and their villages, but it means that the new villages have to look different. They have to have different names, and they have to have, you know, there has to be a sense of invisibility about the previous ones. So constructing, like, let's say, car parks was one tactic, or city parks was another one, or even planting forests was a very common one. And if you plant a forest, it means that you can't see what was there once before, and that's kind of how what happens in ethnic cleansing. And so social dying, therefore, is not just about the fact that people in their experience of being othered have, like, in the sense, a social death because of the fact that they're just not included with everybody else and they're marginalized, ostracized, but it means that the generational change is going to take place because the ones that they leave behind are unable to reconnect to what once was. And that's also true, in fact, with the crisis of refugees expelled from their homes who don't have a right of return, and they can't, in fact, reconnect to that landscape anymore. So what happens, therefore? I'm going to give you a few examples here. One example, in fact, is from Primo Levi. Primo Levi, in his book, Surviving Auschwitz. I mean, his book was also called "If This Is Man," or "Is This Man?" You know, and it's an interesting title, in fact, because the man here, the noun of the man, becomes so so powerfully symbolic in the social experience of social experience of the victims of that time, because there was a sense of demasculinating those victims, right? So a sense of, you're not a man, you're not man enough, you're not manly enough, and so the idea is, well, then, is this man who would do that to another human being, right? That's kind of man's inhumanity towards man. And likewise, in the experience of the African Americans in their struggle and civil rights struggle from the 20th century, even before that time, one of the things you might see, or you might have seen pictures of, is of marches of African Americans holding placards and banners saying, I am a man, and I am a man, And so the idea is that I'm not a boy. That's the idea. I'm not a boy, So I'm not the one that you subjugate and you diminish and you demean and you regard as unworthy and uncivilized and savage and so on and so forth. I am a man. It's a declarative. It's a statement of truth, meaning this is who I am. So therefore, Primo Levi's book was also called, Is This a Man? But also called Survival in Auschwitz. And so therefore he makes this observation, and he says, I'm going to read this to you slightly because I think it's important. He says that this is the idea of social death and social dying. He said, nothing belongs to us anymore. They have taken away our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. If we speak, they will not listen to us. And if they listen, they will not understand. They will even take away our name. And if we want to keep it, we will have to find in ourselves the strength to do so, to manage somehow so that behind the name something of us as we were still remains. So it's actually very emotive to read this. It's very emotional, but it's very powerful. I'll read the last line again. He says, to manage somehow so that behind the name something of us as we were still remains. And that's what social death and what social dying actually is there. Now, the second bullet point is othering is in-grouping and an out-grouping. So therefore, in order to create the other, you have to have, of course, the in-group. And the in-group, in fact, is the result of the out-group or vice versa. So the out-grouping is the othered one. And in order for that to exist in the first place, there has to be an in-grouping, right? So kind of the self versus the other. And the way that the self, in fact, the way that the other is created is through the self. That's the whole point in the first. It's through the self. So it's based upon a human being or human beings, people, society, groups, gangs, cults, believing themselves to be so worthy of human privileges and rights and so on and so forth, that they believe that the out group then are those who are not the humans that the in group are, or not the worthy. The other becomes the unworthy, the uncivilized, and then the savage, and so on and so forth. And so this could be based on many factors. One is disability. So you could, people could look towards disabled people as being so inherently different to the healthy-bodied ones that they don't have a place in the world of the healthy-bodied ones. So therefore, healthy-bodied ones could be a grouping in and of themselves. Or even if we don't think of it like that, psychologically, that could exist, right? Or subconsciously it could exist. So subconsciously you might think, well, my company, my peers in society are the ones who don't have impediments of, let's say, walking, for example, are not wheelchair bound, for example, right? So you could look at the wheelchair bound ones as so far removed from you and your living experiences that you simply don't see them as part of you or part of your human society anymore. And that's a tragic example, in fact, of othering based on disability. There was a man in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and this man, in fact, was blind. He was blind, and the Prophet would say to his companions, he would say, انطلقوا بنا إلى البصير. He would say that, come and let's go and visit the one who has vision, and insight. Even though the man was blind, the Prophet ﷺ did not typify him as a blind person per se, right? So his own blindness, of course, was his own challenge in life. But the Prophet taught that in the way that he's supposed to be understood in relation to us, and we in relation to him, is that we do not demean or belittle or look down upon him based upon his disability. But the fact is, there is a greater conferring of honor upon him on the fact that he has faith, he has belief, he has character, and so many other things. And he would say, therefore, let us go and see the one, let us go and visit the one who has vision. You know, he has vision and perception, and it's beautiful, beautiful demonstration of how the Prophet ﷺ taught us to engage with other people. And then, of course, number two, race. And that's one of our, of course, main discussions today about the element of race. Race is a very common one. You know, the complexion of a person's skin becomes, therefore, the identifying marker by which and through which we see social acceptability, by which we see acceptance, worthiness, unworthiness, and so on and so forth, and so on, socioeconomic status as well. And I had here a very famous poem that you guys might remember doing if you did your GCSEs maybe some years back. So it's called Two Beautiful People in a Mercedes, Two Scavengers in a Truck. It's by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, if I remember. Again, this poem is discussed in my book on being human, which you can download for free on Sapiens Institute website. And you can clearly see from the title itself, Two Beautiful People in a Mercedes, Two Scavengers in a Truck, the juxtaposition there, the contrasting there of people who are beautiful and in a Mercedes, and then the others who are scavengers and are not afforded an adjective here to describe them really in any sense, and they're in a truck as opposed to the Mercedes. But the poem is interesting because what it shows is that so in the poem you have the people in the Mercedes, the man and the woman, who coming from their architect's office, they are seen by the two people in the garbage truck, right? Because it's a red light. They stop at the traffic lights, you know, and it says it's only the red light that holds these two couples together for an instant, for a small moment. And it says that they're hanging on. I remember reading, and it says that the two men are hanging on and looking down. But even hanging on and looking down are metaphoric, you know, are more symbolic of life itself, you know, hanging on to life and looking down. And looking down, in fact, could be the inverse. It could be that the people in the Mercedes might be looking down on the others. But looking down could also be a way of, I don't know, now when I think about it, is it a way for us, is it a way of offsetting the idea that we're creating these altitudes, we're creating these heights, and they're so superficial, right? So who's looking down on who's at the height? The garbage men, interestingly, ironically, are at the height looking down on the people in the Mercedes. And even though we know what it means in the poem, hanging on and looking down, but maybe the poet had it in his mind that we're supposed to be seeing it the other way around as well, maybe. But of course, poetry is poetry. So it's an interesting poem, therefore. And then he says that, and he speaks about the high seas of this great gulf of our democracy. And he's speaking about the fact that even though we're together, in reality, we're not together, right? Because we can use the economic status of others, or of ourselves, to create these in-groups and out-groups, that we just simply hang around and stick around with those that we know are wealthy as we are, you know, and we should never ever do that. The example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that he would be, and this is in fact the example of prophets. Prophets were with those who were on the margins of human society. Prophets were with those who were on the fringes of human society. The Prophet says that the best marriage is that you invite the poor to your wedding. You don't simply have a wedding ceremony and only the wealthy ones are invited. But what about the poor people who are never invited? Why don't you invite those people? And the Prophet ﷺ, would take the hands of poor people. In fact, a man once came and he said, it says in the hadith, it says, "Yashku qaswata qalbi." He says a man came complaining about the hardness of his heart. And the Prophet says to him, "Atuhibbu an yalina qalbak?" Do you want that Allah, softens your heart? وَتُدْرِكْ حَاجَتْكَ, and Allah fulfills your needs. And the man says, "Indeed, I would love that, O Messenger of Allah." And the Prophet then says to him, "Irham al-yatim wamsah ra'sahu wa'at'imhu min ta'amik yalin qalbuk tudrik hajatak." Or kama qala, he says, and if you want that to happen, then have mercy on the orphan and feed him from your food, and Allah will soften your heart and Allah will fulfill your needs. Right? And he says, and wipe over his head with this kind of symbolic gesture of mercy and kindness, and feed him from your food, and Allah will soften your heart, fulfill your needs. So therefore it's beautiful. So therefore also othering is to generalize, right? What does that mean? That means that in reality, what is society? Society is a complex mesh of human beings, individuals. The example I've just given you of Viktor Frankl and the others as well are simply stating the obvious point that every single one of us is an individual. And so therefore, if we're seeing others, groups, people as a kind of a generalized mesh of people, that they all must think the same, they all must believe the same, they all must have same value judgments in life, that's the way that we would otherize those people, right? Because the opposite is true. The idea is that everybody in fact is an individual with different thoughts and values and beliefs and feelings as well. So therefore, othering is to generalize, is to marginalize, and therefore this leads to discrimination. We're going to go through some accounts now of the kind of discrimination this would result in. Now, othering, in fact, is also a false creation, right? It's something that's not true. It's a characterizing of another, a false creation. It obscures the true identity, the true worth, and the true value of another. It demoralizes. Of course it does. Of course it does. It's going to demoralize, right? So if a person knows that they're being perceived of as less valuable, less worthy, less important by others, it's going to demoralize them, right? It's going to make them feel as if, well, they're not good enough. They're not good enough. They're not acceptable enough, right, to be with the company or with the group that's the dominant group in society, and it generates an irrational fear of another, right? So by castigating, by marginalizing, by removing some people out of the dominant frame by which we look at the world, makes us fear those others as if they're not fully human, as if they're subhumanized entities. And this, of course, is exactly what happens and is happening and has happened, in examples of mass conflict, mass killing, human genocide as well, right? An irrational fear of another, leading to hatred, abuse, and savagery. Now, here we have an example of Emmett Till. Emmett Till might be a name that you might be familiar with, maybe not, but it's kind of it's like a watershed moment, really, I think, in the civil rights struggle, because of that key year, 1955. It was the same year, in fact, that Rosa Parks made her defiant decision to remain seated on the bus in Montgomery. And that, of course, led to the Montgomery bus boycott for 381 days, and it had a kind of a big effect on the economy, and it kind of galvanized the spirit of African Americans, and also with whites as well, who had this solidarity with the African Americans in the struggle. But remember, of course, it wasn't her to begin with. It was also Claudette Colvin, who was only 16-year-old, but also refused to give her place to the white man on the bus as well. But Rosa Parks becomes really paradigmatic, influential. In the same year, therefore, we also had the slaughter of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was I think 14, 15-year-old boy. He was, in fact, from Chicago, but he persuaded his mother, Maya Till, to allow him, I think him and maybe another sibling, to travel down south to Alabama. No, was it Alabama? Yeah, Mississippi, to spend time with his cousin. His mother, Maya Till, initially resisted the idea, but then she gave in to his demand, and then he goes there, and then he's I mean, there is, of course, there is a dominant narrative which has been in fact challenged in some reports as well, but in the dominant one it says that he was in a sweet shop, and a white woman came in, and he apparently wolf whistled, and then she informed her husband. The husband that night, together with his friend or his brother, went to the home that he was staying in, with his cousin and the cousin's grandfather, I think it was, and he was beaten to death. He was taken to the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi, beaten to death, I mean, so horrifically, and killed, and then dumped in the river. And then, of course, he's reported, and then when they interviewed the cousin and the grandfather, who informed them that night they came and they took him and they killed him. When the body was taken out of the river, it was so badly disfigured that they enclosed it in a box, and they sealed the box, and they tried to convince the mother, Maya Till, not to open the box, right? Because they don't want to see what's been done to her son. And she said no. She said, "This is my son, and I want to see my son." And then in the funeral of Emmett Till, it says around 1/3 of all people in the church that they fainted when they saw what they did to that young child. Now I want to read this. This is and just pay attention a lot to what's in red as well, because I thought that's really important. These kind of ideas. The mother, Maya Till, says that we buried Emmett. The state of Mississippi said that was not Emmett. They said that it was impossible for a body to deteriorate that much in that length of time. But what they didn't say, they didn't bring out that the body was badly beaten, that the river water had burst the skin and it had peeled off the body. The water was hot. The beating was brutal. Then to beat him, they didn't hear his cries. Look at that. They didn't hear his cries. That's a very powerful thing, of course, for a mother to say here about her son. It's almost as if it's saying, had they heard his cries, wouldn't they have stopped beating him? I mean, if they heard his cries, wouldn't that have made them stop beating him if they'd heard his cries, right? Because in reality, when we speak about empathy, right, and of course she's alluding to this, and what she's saying is that empathy is really to be alert to our human codes of recognizability, the fact that we can recognize with other people because of the fact that our human codes are same or similar, if not identical. We all cry at times, we all laugh at times, we all feel sad at times, we all feel really happy at times. I mean, all of these are simple codes of understanding who we are as simply as human beings. And she said they didn't hear his cries, they didn't touch them whatsoever. This one little colored boy that did hear them said that he heard screams coming from that barn about an hour and a half. He cried for God, he cried for his mother. Look at that. He pleaded with them, but they were having such a good time, so they didn't consider that he was a human being. And look at that. Look at that last line. Having such a good time, so they didn't consider that he was a human being. I mean, I mean, this is it, right? They didn't consider he was a human being, right? So therefore, in their minds, this Emmett Till has become the subhuman. He's become the subhuman. He's become the the Ubermensch. He's become the ones. He's become the marginalized. He's no longer part within that human frame. And what that human frame really means in reality is that the perpetrators believe themselves to be so honorable or so deserving because of the color of their skin, and Emmett Till, because of the color of his skin, was therefore undeserving, right, of all the things, those moral rights, those human rights that human beings are afforded, meaning basic rights of decency, basic rights of being treated with respect and on and so on and so forth. But because he was an African American, complexion color was different, They didn't see that he was a human being. So it's a very tragic account there of from the mother of Emmett Till, Maya Till. And here's another example. In this example, again, it's to do with the idea of color and complexion. This is from John Howard Griffin. Now, John Howard Griffin, in fact, this is again is to do with the struggle of African Americans, particularly in the 1950s. John Howard Griffin was a white individual who decided to have his skin colored black, and he describes it here, so that he could experience what Black people are experiencing of racism in their towns and villages and in cities. And he writes this, and he says, I learned within a very few hours that no one was judging me by my qualities as a human individual. Look what's in red there. By my qualities as a human individual. Right? So therefore, the contrast here is between the value. What's valuable? Is it going to be the superficial color of our skin, or something that's more transcendental, more intrinsic, more powerful? And that is, of course, the qualities we have as human beings. And everyone was judging me by my pigment, he says. As soon as white men or women saw me, they automatically assumed I possessed a whole set of false characteristics. This is why it's, of course, a characterizing, like I mentioned, false not only to me, but to all Blacks. And I think this is so powerful, so powerful. Let's read that again. As soon as white men or women saw me, they automatically assumed I possessed a whole set of false characteristics, false not only to me, but to all Black men, meaning it's a complete fictitious characterizing, meaning it's something that's being created, imputed upon them from their imagination, right? And that has no truth bearing at all. They could not see me or any other Black man as a human individual, because they buried us under the garbage of their stereotype view of us. And it's so powerful what he's saying here. They could not see me or any other Black man as a human individual because they buried us under the garbage of their stereotype view of us. The human being, therefore, does not emerge. They saw us as different from themselves in fundamental ways. We were irresponsible. We were different in our sexual morals. We were intellectually limited. We had a God-given sense of rhythm. We were lazy and happy-go-lucky. We loved watermelon and fried chicken. How could white men ever really know Black men if on every contact the white man's stereotype view of the Black man got in the way? I never knew a Black man who felt this stereotype view fit him. Always, in every encounter, even with good whites, we had the feeling that the white person was not talking with us, but with his image of us. I think this account of John Howard Griffin is so powerful and so representative of what othering really is, and also what othering really does. The falsity of kind of a pseudo creation, really a characterization of somebody else that's an untrue representation of him or her or them, of those people, but because it breeds and it has existed, it's going to create this sense of chasm, difference and binary distinction between those two sets of people. One, of course, is going to be vilified, victimized, and the other would be, therefore, the dominant perpetrator, inflicting cruelty and and injustice, abuse, torture, terror, murder on that other. And then that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing here. So I want us to really think, therefore, about what is it? What is the culture? What is the climate that would lead to those horrific deaths of the individual we mentioned in the beginning, George Floyd, for example? And why is it that he would have a police officer with his knee on that individual's neck for so long, and he's pleading for his life? I can't breathe. And sometimes he's even calling out to his mother, Mama. He's saying that. And think about the fact that, what we just read about Emmett Till. Not Emmett Till. Yeah, Emmett Till it was, right? That he cried for his mother, right? Cried for his mother, right? I mean, that's a human thing there. We all have mothers, right? And so we're seeing that here. Now, what is it, in fact, that we're seeing? We keep saying that we're seeing, but what is it that we're seeing? So who and what do we see? If we look at this watercolor painting here, this is called Surrounded by Torturers He Cannot See. See, think about it. Who can't see who? Now, this individual in this painting, who has his head covered in a hooding, right? He's surrounded by torturers, but he can't see them, right? Just take a few seconds to look at it. We're going to talk about it in a second, but just look at it. Look at it. This is from image courtesy of the Rehabilitation and Research Center for Torture Victims, Copenhagen, Denmark. Okay, so look at him. Look at what he's wearing. Look at that blood mark on his shirt. Look at his clothing. Look at his feet. Look at the hood on his head. And look at what that hood looks like. Okay? Look at those guards behind him and look at what they look like. Look at the halo around him and think about, what is that halo? What is that symbol? What does it represent? How is it created? How is it there? All right? So once we've seen it, we're going to move on. Here we are, juxtaposed observation. So on the one hand, of course, we saw that halo. What does it mean? What does it represent? Is it a halo? Now, it all depends what we're looking at, because it could in fact be that the guards have a torch and they're shining the torch behind him, and then that creates that kind of halo effect around him. But perhaps we're supposed to see him as if there is a halo around him. Why wouldn't there be? That's a question to ask, isn't it? Why wouldn't there be, or why shouldn't there be? See, it's about, sometimes we have these false assumptions of other human beings. It could be that you're looking at somebody and you're thinking, you might not be thinking the best about them, but the kind of things that you might, because remember, the othering is about what you believe to be so good in yourself, you don't believe that to be in somebody else, right? And then what it creates this kind of an arrogance or pride about you, because you're seeing yourself as superior and others as inferior. And so therefore think about what that halo, which might not be a halo, but perhaps it should be a halo. Why shouldn't it be a halo? What it should represent in our life, right? What is the halo that we create? Should we create halo around the people that we're observing and seeing in our world today? And what that could mean is a bit like what the Prophet says about the man who was blind. Let's go and visit the one who has vision and can see. It's creating something, giving that individual the goodness, the ingredient of kindness and mercy and goodness that all people should be afforded. What about the swollen feet? Or if you go back and see the swollen feet there, what do they represent? Now, of course, there could be swollen feet because they've been beaten. So because they've been beaten, but the swollen feet could also represent kind of a stamped presence. Maybe the swollen feet, in fact, is his sense of defiance and dignity. Maybe they represent his courage and bravery. Maybe they represent his kind of internalized authority, right? What about the hood? Now, the hood, in fact, is one of the most important because the hood is bear-like, right? So the otherized individual who's going to end up being dehumanized is precisely that, is dehumanized. And so one of the first things that you see is a very common thing in examples of human genocide and in great injustice, is that the other victims, dehumanized ones, are given these animalistic labels, like they're beasts is another one, bears could be another one, cockroaches, vermin, rats, as an infestation that has to be removed. But the bear here is a symbol, of course, of this man's defiance, maybe it's his defiance that ends up him being a prisoner here in the first place, right? But because he's made to look bear-like, right? Think about what that creates in the minds of those guards behind him, as if he's some kind of a spectacle in some kind of a zoo, as if he's a captured animal, heralded because he's captured now, for the world to see. It's a very good book to read called The Spectacle It's called The Spectacle, The Tragedy of Otabenga. And this, in fact, I also discussed in my book on being human, which you can download for free on Sapiens Institute website. The tragedy of Otabenga, who in fact was put, with monkeys, in fact, in Bronx Zoo, in the beginning and end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century. It's a very good book to read. In fact, it's by I forgot the author's name, but you can see the reference in my book. Anyway, so you can see therefore what the hood represents there. The bear-like, right? The bear-like, the animal-like, animalistic, wild connotations of savage and wild and brutal, right? Unlike, of course, the gods behind him, right? So therefore, on the one hand, of course, you also have here the hands, and the hands, of course, are unseen. Hands could represent power, could represent, authority, but the hands are hidden, so we can't see them. And think about the juxtaposing here of isolation and togetherness, the pack, predator, prey, irony. So, of course, the ones at the back are the ones who are together, and he himself is isolated. So, where you might think about the animal that operates as a pack. In this case, it's the juxtaposition of the gods who behind him, in fact, who are as a pack, and he himself is the isolated one over here, right? So he is therefore the prey, and then they happen to be the predators, and not the other way around. Think about worry and pain, defiance and strength. So the worry and the pain that we can't see on the person's face, because his face is concealed, it's hidden from view, it's invisible, right? You can't see the pain there. A very good book to read is called Kiribati. This is by S. Yizhar, published in 1959, if I remember. And this is a book that details the tragedy of the Nakba, 1948, written by, in fact, by an Israeli author. This is historicized fiction of what actually happened with the dispossession of homes and the fact that you have settler colonialism here, because these new settlers are coming in and taking the homes of the native inhabitants of that land of Palestine. But Kiribati is very powerful. I think one of my I'm going to read inshallah something from it that I think was really really important. The worry and the pain. So what's hidden therefore is very key in defiance and strength. And then of course the clothing is very key here, also between the civil and between the savage. And so therefore the uniform of the gods comes to connote and represent, symbolize civility, order, right? Everything looks neat, everything looks good. They all use uniformity because they're all wearing the same uniforms, but the prisoner here, who is the victim, isolated victim here, who is made to look like a beast and an animal, is seen represented as savage because of his clothing is torn and so on and so forth. There's a beautiful example in the Quran in Surah Al-Yusuf, and in Surah Yusuf it says that when Yusuf alayhi salam was thrown in the well, Allah in the Quran says, and then these caravan people came, and Allah says, وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمْنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمَ مَعْدُودَةٍ وَكَانُوا فِيهِ مِنَ الزَّاهِدِينَ, that they sold him for a small price. You can count on your fingers, and they didn't think much of him, even though he was the Prophet Yusuf, the boy at that time, Yusuf alayhi salam. But it's all about our perception, what we're seeing of others, and based upon that perception of others, it's what we're going to afford them or not afford them of social space, in our social spaces, of worthiness, of goodness, and so on and so forth. And so therefore, who and what do we see? Now, this in fact is from K. Tudor, Understanding Empathy, Transactional Analysis Journal. And he says is that when a torturer looks upon his victim, he can certainly directly see agony in his face and humiliation in his posture. The problem, though, is the light in which he sees it. That's very powerful, actually. So on the one hand, of course, we had Dave Grossman in his book on killing, right, and the idea of altitude and attitude. But Harry's saying that when a torturer, even the torturer is, of course, not in altitude, he's in proximity with his victim, It's the problem is the light in which he sees that victim. It is not a matter of the torturer needing to infer a little further to another more inner realm in which the moral properties of the other's situation will be revealed. It is a matter of how he sees the other's condition. What are we seeing of other people, right? What did those policemen not see of George Floyd? What could they not see of Eric Garner as he's pleading, more than 25 times, I can't breathe. I mean, that's a lot of times to say one thing. 25 times, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. I mean, you try and say it 25 times, I can't breathe, 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 I can't breathe. Just try and say that. Try and say that 25 times in the different intonations you could use to try and stress on the same message again and again and again. Try and do that, right? It's a lesson of empathy. Just try and do that. You're trying to say the same thing in the hope that one of those attempts you're making would be felt by the perpetrator, that in his inner conscience he could be able a sense of emotional bearing with that person, with the victim. But of course it didn't work, and it wasn't there. That means that there was, lack of empathy, lack of humanity, in what happened. So therefore, it's a matter of how he sees the other's condition. The torturer has the reality of the other's suffering squarely in front of him under a clear light, but that light is somehow wrong. Look at that. The light is somehow wrong. Look at that. The light is somehow wrong. We're using the wrong light. We're using the wrong lenses by which we're seeing and appreciating others around us. We're not affording people what they're supposed to be afforded because our light is wrong, right? So it's about the light by which you see. It is a peculiarly cold and harsh light, one that flattens and exposes the other, cuts and holds him open, all the better to probe and toy with him. What is needed is a different light. And this is so powerful and it's so true, And so I would argue, therefore, the light that we need is the light of Islam, to look upon the world with the light of Islam, with the rahmah, with the mercy that Islam mandates upon us as human beings to consider. So dehumanization, therefore, is a relegating of another to a distant sub-other. It is a seeing in the other much less, and sometimes a complete absence of what one sees in oneself. All that is morally reprehensible is defined in that other. So therefore, you're imputing the worst of whatever's in you, your cruelty, selfish, your selfishness, your arrogance, your pride, your evil, you're now imputing upon somebody else. And that's what dehumanization is. Now, what it is really is a stripping away, right? It's a stripping away of the moral human code which bonds us as human beings. The kind of social vitality behind a person or a group is stripped away, and this defacing precedes any physical injury or death inflicted on that victim, right? So we spoke about, therefore, the idea of social death, social dying, and this, of course, is going to lead to the dehumanizing of the people who are the victims of social death and dying. But this really begins on our mental canvases. So we just read from Tudor about the idea of the light by which or through which we're seeing people. This begins in our mental canvas. All of us have a mental canvas. But if on mental canvases the dehumanized other is painted with broad strokes and wide brushes, meaning that there are no identifications, no fine lines, no nuances, no grays, no colors, no subtle outlines. All we're left with is this generalized mesh, of just nothingness. I have a book being published now, inshallah, it's called Navigating War, Dissent, and Empathy in Arab-US Relations, Seeing Our Others in Darkened Spaces, published by Springer, inshallah, coming out next month. But I have a chapter in that book called Landscaping Otherness and Challenging Frames of Nothingness in Contemporary Palestine, right? So frames of nothingness, you're creating a sense of nothingness about others, because you're disallowing those finer lines, those finer identification points, right? Those points of beauty, right? Points of beauty and handsomeness and so on and so forth, and goodness, because, and that's therefore created, you know, from our in our mental canvas. It's about, therefore, the light by which we're seeing people, and the colors with which we're using to paint people, what we're drawing of people in our minds, right? And how we're painting them, really, with what strokes and with what kinds of brushes as well. Historical example, the Untermensch versus the Übermensch, right? The undermen, you know, and then the upper men, the undermen, as in the gypsies, as in the victims of the Holocaust, the Jews, even the mentally handicapped. Remember as well, we spoke about dehumanization and othering in terms of mental of disability, but also mental disability. It could be therefore that you look upon people who have illnesses like autism or Asperger's syndrome, for example, are as so far removed from your kind of social realm or your social world that we kind of castigate them as others, and of course we should never ever do that. But that's what the Nazis also did. They also, of course, killed off the mentally handicapped children as well. And so therefore the Untermensch versus the Übermensch, the undermen versus the upper men. And the upper men would be the able-bodied one, you know, the lighter skin, the Aryan race, for example, who were kind of believed to be the best of all humans. And that's, of course, the tragedy. And the language of dehumanization, we've discussed this, in fact, before, about the way that the dehumanized are always the kind of the cockroaches, and the vermin are always the rats, you know, always the kind of the savages, and so on and so forth. And this is very typical language of dehumanization, but also in others as well. So, for example, like I mentioned, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So the kind of things that you might find there, in fact, you do find there in the accounts of the refuseniks, who are ex-IDF soldiers, and that they say that the kind of language we use for Palestinians is that Palestinians are the unemployed. Palestinians are unemployed. You know, they are the ones who are lazy. You know, they are erratic. Arabs are erratic, unemployed, lazy. You know, violence, for example. And so these typifications are carried through a lot in social life, in discussions, in media, on movies, in television, in news framing, for example. A good book called Real Bad Arabs, real as in REEL, Bad Arab, by Jack Sheehan, where he examines American movies, you know, for like 100 years. I mean, going through movies and where Arabs are presented, and by and large always presented as the you know, as the other, you know, as the one who is irresponsible, as the one who is a womanizer, as the one who is a terrorist, as the one who is a cheat, you know, as the one who is duplicitous, you know, all these negative tropes imputed upon, and therefore what it does is it builds up this mental image of who the Arab actually is then. I discuss this at length, in fact, in my book, and about the way that it makes empathy far more difficult, because you have to unpeel layers and layers and layers and layers of stereotyping that's built up for a very long time. And part of this is connected to the language of dehumanization here. Now, what is the Quranic solution? What is the Quranic outlook towards all of this, the Quranic paradigm? Undercutting and offsetting binary distinctions fueled by hate. Very powerful how we do that. So let's look at it like this. So therefore, Allah in the Quran, He says, another of His signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and colors. There truly are signs in this for those who know. Allah is saying, therefore, the diversity here in people's languages and colors is not a cause for them to hold others in contempt and to disregard others and to make these binary distinctions. On the contrary, Allah is saying it's a cause for us to marvel at the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how Allah created with such perfection different things, different colors of plants, different colors of, you know, flowers, different colors of things, and different colors of human beings also. These truly, Allah says, are signs in this for those who know. The other verse in the Quran, from chapter 49, verse 13, people, we created you all from a single man and a single woman, and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another. In God's eyes, in Allah's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones most mindful of Him. And Allah is all-knowing and all-aware. This ayah, this verse is so powerful, really. You know, it's one of the verses that was reflected upon by Malcolm X, in fact, in the autobiography, and in his experience of the Hajj. This is one of the verses that he mentioned, that this is a solution to racism in America. If they knew what Islam says about the togetherness of that human spirit and the human beings, that races and tribes have there's no bearing, in the sense that these are not for the purpose of setting up walls and boundaries and barriers between us, but it's simply for us to recognize who each person is, but then to also remember that it is not on account of the race to which you belong or the tribe to which you belong that it has any sense of measure on your nobility or your greatness and goodness, but in fact, the most honored of you with Allah are those who have the most piety, are the ones who are the most mindful of Him. That's what the most important thing is. And therefore, God, man, and the pursuit of human dignity. Look at the verse in the Quran here. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. We have certainly ennobled and honored the children of Adam. There is a general nobility unto human beings. And of course, whatever they do later on is they're doing, right? You could reach heights, amazing heights of goodness and excellence, and you could also, fail in that and bring yourself into ruin by your behavior, your belief, your attitude towards other people as well. But at the baseline, the basic state of man is simply one of being honored as being the children of Adam. And the closest then to Allah would be those who have the most closeness in their hearts towards Him and their actions towards Him, and not on account of the superficial outward, how tall or how short you are, how big or how thin you are, or how how healthy or how sick you are, right? How light or how dark you might be. All of these things are just simply the fact that we're human beings and human beings are different. And it's not about picking on differences so that we create these antagonisms between people, but it is about marveling in the splendor of Allah's creation. Allah created differently, but Allah did not make those differences a benchmark by which we see and value other people. It's not like that, but it's about the fact that the benchmark is always going to be how close we are with Allah, and that's a matter of the heart to begin with anyway. So, and again, undercutting, offsetting by distinctions, fueled by hate. The Quranic paradigm is about principles of justice to counter in-group biases. So we could run risk, in fact, of having in-group biases because we create in groups or we're within groups, but then because we're looking at the others with that false light, with the wrong light, as we learned from Tudor and others, we could act on impediments of love and hate. There's two very key verses in the Quran about that. In fact, one of them says, when Allah says, "O you who believe, be upright witnesses to justice, for Allah, even if it's against yourselves, walau ala anfusikum, or if it's against your parents, whether they're wealthy or poor." Allah is saying, don't let the impediment of love, right, make you unjust. Right, because you could refuse to be just because you love somebody or something so much. And there's also another verse in the Quran like the first verse, but there's a small difference in it. It says, "Oh, you believe, be upright, for Allah." This time Allah comes first as witnesses to justice, and don't let the hatred you might have for a people swerve you from being just. Dilu, be just. It is closer to piety, right? So therefore, beware of that. Look at the bullet points here. Allah in the Quran says, "Laysu sawa." They're not all the same. Nobody, in fact, is all the same. No two people are the same. So how can the whole group, in fact, be all the same? No two people are all the same. No two brothers are the same. No two sisters are the same. Everyone is different. They're not all the same, Allah says. So you might even find here disbelievers. If you look at even the disbelievers in the Prophet's time, there were disbelievers in the Prophet's time. Let's say the early Meccan stage, people like Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, who were like staunch enemies of the Prophet. But you also have people like Abu Talib, who was not a Muslim, never embraced Islam, but he was a supporter of the Prophet's cause, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Therefore, they're not all the same. Mut'im ibn Adi is another example, who was of the Mushrikeen. He died from the Mushrikeen, but he was a supporter of the Prophet. He gave help and assistance. But therefore, the example is they're not all the same. And then, of course, the same verse here, we've ennobled the sons of Adam from chapter 17, verse 70. Now, therefore, othering now versus bridging. So solutions, therefore, othering is the constructing of radical differences in groups and out groups. We spoke about our mental canvases before. Let's take a look at the prophetic principle here now. The Prophet in his final sermon, he says that there is no superiority for an Arab over a non-Arab, right? And for a non-Arab over an Arab, or for white over the black, or for the black over the white, except in piety. So therefore, the racial differences mean nothing, right? Mean nothing. No superiority to do with those things except in piety. Then he says, indeed, the noblest amongst you is he or she who is the most pious, right? The most pious, right? That's the scale. That's what Allah is concerned with. And your piety is reflected in many things. Your belief, right? Your belief about Allah, your religion, but also reflected in your character. How well you are towards other people is a reflection of your piety. How well spoken you are, how kind you are, how considerate, how merciful you are, how charitable you are, how forgiving you are, how forbearing you are. All of these are reflections of a person's piety. The collapsing of binary. So therefore, where you might have people who succumb to this, the creating of these binaries. In the prophetic example, we have a beautiful account of the collapsing of these binaries. So, very famous story of Bilal and Abu Dhar. Allah be pleased with them both, the Prophet's companions. So once Abu Dhar said to, and by the way, these were new converts to Islam who didn't know that much all the time, but he says to Bilal, who was an Abyssinian slave, he says, who then became Muslim, he says to him, Yabna Sauda, O son of a black woman, right? So he had an argument with him, and he said these words to him. Bilal was so offended, and he thought, well, that's so counter and contrary to the Islamic ideals by which we're being taught by the Prophet. He went and complained to the Prophet about what Abu Dhar just said to him. And the Prophet was very upset with Abu Dhar. And then Abu Dhar came later to the Prophet's house, and he could see the Prophet was not happy with him. And then he realized Bilal must have come and told him the story. And so the Prophet says to Abu Dhar, he says, did you say what you said to Bilal? He said to him, you are a man, you still have ignorance inside of you. That's still old. That's like pre-Islamic, before Islam. That's how people would value each other based upon the color of their skin. He says, we're not that. That's finished with Islam. Islam has finished that. So he says that that's not the way that we act. And Abu Dhar was so saddened. I mean, he was so remorseful that he sought to, make amends with Bilal. And it's beautiful, this sense of companionship between them, even thereafter, with a newfound kind of respect for one another in that. So therefore, othering versus bridging. Bridging allows us to open spaces to foster understanding, communication, and enhancing of the collective human spirit. Now, othering disallows all of that. Othering disallows opening spaces, disallows understanding, disallows communication, disallows enhancing collective human spirit. All of that is disallowed. But bridging, in fact, allows these new spaces to be open to foster understanding, communication. And the best, of course, of this comes from da'wah, comes from calling others to Allah, calling others to Islam, right? With that sense of great respect that whatever I, as a human being, am seeking in terms of knowing who my Lord is, worshipping him the way he wants me to worship him, following the best example that Allah gave us to follow, and of course having a hope for Allah's mercy and then a beautiful abode in the next life in heaven, then of course I would wish the same for other people as well. To do that, of course, you have to recognize your own human potential, your own human weaknesses, your human transitioning, navigating, journeying in life as that human being is transitioning, navigating, and journeying in life as well. Again, human codes of recognizability. That's the whole point. And then, of course, bystanding versus rescuing. So one of the things that you might have, I was very happy. In fact, I was, of course, the whole George Floyd thing was really, really troubling. It was very upsetting. But the fact that there were people who were trying to, to shout at those police officers and to record what was happening, and began to, even insult them sometimes about just stop doing what you're doing. Means that in life, I mean, whenever we have examples of injustice, you're going to have perpetrators and victims and bystanders and rescuers, and bystanding versus rescuing. Now, you could have, for example, a situation in in a workplace, in a school environment, on the streets, where somebody is a victim of racism, where bad words are used, where insults are made on the buses, on the coaches, trains. This could happen. This happens all the time. But you have a responsibility in that sense. You have a responsibility, because remember, we spoke about the burdening, the weight, right, that the tree felt, when it had that lynched victim on itself, that burdening. Remember, I can't breathe and we can't breathe, on the person, and the plural pronoun of that collective human tugging at our consciousness. So therefore, think about injustice. The Prophet said, "Ittaqul dhulam," beware of injustice. Injustice will appear as darkness on the day of judgment. Fair avarice, it destroyed those before you and caused them to shed one another's blood and to make lawful what was unlawful. Right? So beware of injustice. And remember, your role is a rescuer, not a bystander, not somebody who sees the racism and sees the hate, and simply bystands and walks away and has this indifference. No, we have to have empathy over indifference, right? Empathy over indifference, and that's going to be really the place of the rescuer. And then the final points for us are these: to focus on individuals and not peoples, because peoples generally are not all the same, as Allah said, and we've discussed that before. Othering is a self-effacing. What does that mean? That means that when you otherize somebody, you're ruining something of yourself, right? Because remember, it's imputing something evil of yourself unto another. But to do that, of course, you have to ruin something in yourself to begin with first. So it's a self-effacing. The Prophet says that the believer is a mirror to his brother, meaning what we see of others is what we have in ourselves, right? What we see of others is what we have seen in ourselves. What we see of others is what we're going to see in ourselves. Therefore, we're all human in that sense. But to other is to self-efface. It is to ruin something in oneself before it's ruined in another. Just like the way that there's a very good book called A is for Ox by Barry Sanders. It's American author, so they say ox. So this is what A is for ox, but it really taps into this idea about the way that speaks about gangsters in America in the 1990s, and about the way, kind of the importance of literacy and so on. But it has this kind of idea, within that book about othering is this idea of self-effacing. Remember what hate can create. Hate creates. What does hate create? Think about that. What we just saw or heard about in Canada, just a few days ago, with that individual who ran over that Muslim family. 4 members of one Muslim family were killed in that, and 1 child survived. But just think about that, and it's fueled by hate, by Islamophobia, right? That's 4 members of family just out, that they just killed, right? And what is that? I mean, what was that for? What hate can create, right? Creates evil, creates murder, creates terror, creates genocide. Hate creates genocide. So the starting point, therefore, is is othering, because you're separating, excluding now from the human frame others who are not, who you think are not like you, or they might have one small difference. Therefore, that small difference, it becomes now the mountain that you would use. Just like, for example, genocide of Rwanda. You have the Hutus and the Tutsis, and one group had more pointed noses, other ones had chubbier noses. One group were thinner, other group were a bit more plump. But these small differences, and one group was lighter, and a group was darker. The Belgian colonizers used the complexity of people's skins as a way of otherizing, because they gave privileges to the lighter skinned ones and not to the dark skinned ones. They gave better homes, better jobs to the light skinned ones, not to the darker skinned ones. And therefore, this carried through then in kind of retaliatory, evil violence in those tragic 90 to 100 days in 1994. And so therefore, to think about injustice, beware of injustice, as the Prophet said. The importance of diversity. Those verses in the Quran, "O people, we created you, all of you are." And so therefore, in the prophetic final sermon, the Prophet also said, "Kullukum min Adam wa Adam min turab." So when he says, therefore, that the black isn't better than the white, or the white over the black, he says, all of you are from Adam, and Adam was from dust. So powerful. Kullukum min Adam wa Adam min turab. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was from dust, meaning, be humble in life. The prophetic hadith, love for people what you would love for yourself. It's narrated by Bukhari in his Tarikh al-Kabir. Love for people what you would love for yourself. No one wants to be demeaned. Don't wish for others to be demeaned. No one wants to be ostracized and secluded, separated. Don't wish that for somebody else, therefore. No one wants to be, felt as if they're inferior, social outcast, irreprehensible, evil, ugly. Therefore, don't wish that for anybody else. That's the lesson. And allows you to remember that a person's character, and not his race or ethnicity, in fact, is a reflection of his or her goodness, right? So therefore, the heart of a person is simply the heart of goodness. The heart of a person is a measure of that person's goodness. And so therefore, I hope this short, reminder here has been helpful in understanding, what I can't breathe should mean for us now moving forward, looking ahead in our world, in our towns, villages, communities. That I can't breathe really becomes a collective we can't breathe, and we can't breathe as a reflection of that sense of burdening. We feel that burdening, right? Because of the fact that we were supposed to be conscious human beings with a sense of alertness towards injustice, and that Allah made us, responsible in that sense. And so we ask Allah, for success in all things. We ask Allah to rid us of these evils of racism and discrimination and dehumanization towards other people. I'm going to check now, inshallah, if there's any questions that you might have, inshallah. So let's just have a look, inshallah, and see. There we are. And it's time to pray Maghrib, inshallah, but I'm going to quickly have a check, inshallah, and see other questions. So question. So what's the central idea of the poem, Doc? Yeah, the idea of the poem was that if it's the poem, if it's the Haunted Oak poem, then that would be about the fact that Paul Laurence Dunbar encounters this man who writes about the fact that his, I think it was his nephew who was lynched on the tree, and then the tree becomes this witness to that. But the idea would be, therefore, that that the element of empathy emerges even from the tree. The idea that the tree has a sense of feeling for the victim. In our kind of social living, the power of empathy is very meaningful. It's very essential in therefore offsetting these cultures of othering and hate and so on and so forth. because otherwise, we won't be able to feel what the other person is feeling. So therefore, I think there's a strong power of empathy in that poem. But you can read more of it, inshallah, in my book on being human. There's a lot more discussion, inshallah, in that. All right, so yeah, so you're making good comments in your conversations on the chat. I hope, inshallah, you guys took some good lessons from there. All right, alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair to you also for your comments. Jazakallah khair to you also, Tom Tanks, and the others as well. Yeah, so question like, what are similarities between pre-Islamic Arabs and the Nazis, or why the similarity between? Well, it's not about the why. The element that as human beings, of course, are going to act out in different ways in human society, and there's going to be some correlations, of course, as well. The pre-Islamic Arabs, in the way that they treated women, for example, isn't one idea. The way they treated the darker skin, and by this irony, by the way, and even in Abu Dhar and Bilal's exchange in that narrative, the irony is that Abu Dhar himself was very dark-skinned, and the scholars, they say it wasn't therefore only about the fact that he's speaking negatively about Bilal because he's darker-skinned, but because of the fact that he's a non-Arab, because Abu Dhar himself happens to be very dark-skinned, if not even maybe more dark-skinned than Bilal himself. So but the other thing, of course, is about treatment of children, treatment of women, treatment of girls, for example, is another thing. And so all of these things, in fact, they tap into the idea of othering and dehumanization. So I'm going to end it here now because we're going to get very late for Maghrib, inshallah. I want to thank all of you again for your attendance. May Allah bless all of you, and please follow the work at sapiensinstitute.org. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.